You're listening to Citizens History, a podcast asking how an awareness of history might help us to identify and address the most urgent challenges facing the United States and the world. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 14. Wherever you are and however you may be listening, we're glad you're here. I'm Podrick Rowan, a historian at Quincy University. Today is the 12th of July, 2024. And I'm delighted to welcome my co-host, JMatt Ward, whose book, Garden of Ruins, Occupied Louisiana in the Civil War, has just come out. And so this book will be a starting point for a wide-ranging conversation, dealing with his book and with the Civil War more broadly. As always, we invite you to become a part of the conversation and welcome your comments, your criticism, and suggestions for future episodes. Congratulations.
Thanks. I feel a bit conspicuous talking about my own book, but maybe by the end of this discussion I can actually figure out what I was trying to say in however many pages it took to do this.
It's funny how that works. Yeah. Sometimes it takes, and this is true professionally, this is true personally, it's often the case that we don't know exactly what we're going to say until we say it, and it's the process of saying it. It's like, oh, I didn't know I was going to say that, or I have a different vantage point on it now.
Well, I'm glad to know that I'm not the only one who feels that way. Sometimes when I was writing this, I felt like I was just lost in the wilderness, because I had all of this primary documentation that I pulled out of Hill Memorial Library at LSU and the Southern Historical Collection at UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina. And of course the National Archives. I mean, I just had thousands of pictures, and I transcribed as many letters and military orders as I could. And I just started piecing them together into themes, like, okay, here's all the people that got arrested. And here are people, that are trading illegally. And here are people that are smuggling. Here are people that get conscripted into the army. And like, how do I build a narrative out of this? So hopefully I was successful in doing something that was remotely coherent.
So back us up, like give us a little bit of bird's eye. You mentioned taking pictures in the archives, which I know is a very common. Like explain for everyone, how far back does this go? Of when did you begin research on this book?
So I grew up in Mississippi, as I think I've said before on the podcast. So I loved Civil War history. Amory, Mississippi is about 30 miles south of Tupelo, which is most famously known as the birthplace of Elvis, but there was also a minor Civil War battle fought there. It's probably the first battlefield I ever went to. There's like an acre of it with 2 cannons on just some random city block there. But a cannon to like a 10-year-old seems massive.
How close to the river is that?
The Mississippi River?
Uh-huh.
I would say 3 or 4 hours
to
the west.
The river is 3 or 4 hours to the west?
Yes.
Okay.
We were very close to the Alabama line, so maybe about 30 minutes or so from the border of Alabama.
Got it.
Memphis is probably 2.5 hours to the northwest, so northeast Mississippi, I guess what could be considered the very extreme foothills of the Appalachians, so that's more in Alabama.
Uh-huh.
It's more piney wood regions. Not a lot of Civil War action there, but we were close to Shiloh, a huge Civil War battle. We were close to Corinth, which was a major railroad hub, and had several major battles fought over it.
Okay.
Reasonably close to Jackson, Mississippi, and some minor battles fought in that area. Not too far from Vicksburg, very important Civil War battle. So I was fortunate enough to have my parents sort of lug me around all over the South, and some battles in the North as well, like Gettysburg. But anyway, when I got to college, I started reading Confederate women's diaries, as part of my senior thesis, and I was fascinated by the women who were behind Union lines, right, and the way that they write about their relationship to Union soldiers. And it seemed to me, and this is something I found in my master's thesis as well, that women who were under occupation had diaries that were much more dense than women who were, say, just in the Confederate mainland. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. They're frightened. They're trying to preserve a textual record of having kept their honor under pressure. But I became fascinated with more of what I would call the social history aspect of the war, rather than just the fighting and the battles, what's going on behind the lines. So I went to the University of Missouri in 2013. I worked there for 2 years with Dr. Leanne Whites, and she had done a lot of work on guerrilla warfare in Missouri during the Civil War. And she had helped develop this concept known as household war, which is something that I use a lot in this book because I was greatly inspired by that idea. Household war is the idea that the household as a unit, both as a physical unit, but also the relationships within it, the families, had as much to do with the war, especially in supporting the war effort, as frontline battles. So households are making food, uniforms, sending that to their men on the front lines. In Missouri particularly, they're supplying the guerrillas. And the guerrillas come by, they pick up some food, they grab some shirts, they grab a gun, and they go back into the woods. This deeply frustrates the Union commanders because now they're fighting two wars, right? They're chasing the guerrillas around and they're having to deal with the women in their houses, and if they try to arrest the women, as I wrote about in my master's thesis, love to yell at them and spit at them. And what do you do with a rebellious woman? In the 19th century, you can't shoot them. I mean, this is not like World War II, where civilians are treated, for the most part, just very heinously by all sides involved. There's much more thought that goes into how do we treat civilians in the war, especially women. And then Dr. Whites went to the Filson Institute in Kentucky, which was not a university, so I could not follow her to do my PhD. Had to apply to other programs. I went to LSU to work with Aaron Sheehan Dean, and I told him I wanted to keep working on occupation. So I started with these dreams of writing like a history of the entire occupied South, even though one of those already existed from the mid-90s by Steve Ash called When the Yankees Came. It's a massive undertaking, so I decided I'll just focus on Louisiana because the sources are right on campus. The Hill Memorial Library has a huge collection of Southern sources, and there wasn't that much work done on Louisiana. There's like 2 books, one from 1941, one from 1963, on Louisiana and the Civil War. They're pretty dated. There are 3 books on military occupation in the Civil War, Ash's When the Yankees Came, and then 2 written by the gentlemen who were kind enough to give me blurbs on the back of my book, Greg Downs, After Appomattox, and Andy Lang, In the Wake of War, which was also particularly helpful for this study. So as I say, on page 7.
Now hold on. Let's not. I really want to hear a lot of this, but let's circle back to what you were saying about the women, right? Yes. So one of the fascinating episodes about this book for me, one of the things that helped it come alive, was the episode in New Orleans when Benjamin Butler came in as the Union general, I think, and occupied. And the strategies that he and the Union forces used to attempt to neutralize resistance by women.
Yes.
What is one of the things on, I think it was on page 57, one of the things that really leaped out at me was, okay, as you're talking about General Order Number 28, I want you to explain what General Order Number 28 is. And then there were references to the women of New Orleans as she-adders,
yes,
right? Poisonous snakes. And if you are plying your avocation,
Yes.
right, if you are a prostitute, then you do not deserve to be treated as a gentlewoman and
Sure.
all the gloves are off.
Yeah.
So, in other words, support the union or you will be treated as a lady of the night.
Yes.
How did that set that up for us? Explain, explain to us a little bit about General Order Number 28, which became known as the Women's Order,
Yes.
right? And how did that play out?
Okay, first I should say that Benjamin Butler was a civilian general. He didn't have any formal military training. He was appointed by the Lincoln administration very soon after the war began.
Okay, so he was not a general.
I mean, he was a general in the Union Army, but prior to the beginning of the Civil War, he was not.
Okay.
He was a lawyer.
Okay.
And something of a politician as well from Massachusetts. And he was also a staunch Democrat in a otherwise Republican state of Massachusetts. In fact, he had voted many times for Jefferson Davis at the 1860 Democratic Convention in Charleston, which is
Wow.
interesting.
Okay.
So he, you can make this argument of several Union generals, but I make the argument that Butler's one of the first, if not the first, to kind of throw the rule book away when it comes to like how the military should act, especially when not only occupying an enemy force, but occupying an enemy force that is your own people, right? That's one of the complicated factors of occupation is how do Americans treat other Americans, and what does that mean about the very meaning of democracy? Do we have the same democracy after the war as we started at the beginning? And I don't think a single historian would say yes to that. But anyway, so Butler comes in because he is not as likely to respect traditional military rule, which probably, I'm not sure how other generals would have responded in Butler's situation in New Orleans. He gets really creative with how to respond to women who are yelling at his troops, spitting at them, refusing to sit next to them on trains or in church pews. And one woman even dumped a chamber pot on a general's head. And so he comes up with General Order Number 28 that for any woman who behaves this way or says anything negative to any of his troops or officers, they will be considered a prostitute and then thrown in jail. He argues that this order is self-enforcing because no woman would ever want to be associated with prostitution. I think that's true to a tiny degree. I think it's also true not only from a gendered lens, but also a class lens. Women don't want to step down from their privileged pedestal into the realm of prostitution. Even though there are historians like Alicia Long who have done excellent work at proving, as I try to say in this chapter about Butler, his order doesn't really end women's resistance, he just shifts it to a different front. So women retreat back into the household, they play patriotic songs with the windows open, they laugh at Union troops, they do all sorts of things to continue their resistance.
Plays Confederate patriotic songs.
Yeah, like the Bonnie Blue Flag and things like this. So this is, again, why I think the framework of household war is particularly useful when looking at the occupied home front, because the house itself, the home itself, is like the base of operations for people who are still resisting the Union. And even though women aren't taking up a weapon and shooting at Union troops like some Confederate soldier on the front lines, playing a Confederate song, spitting at Union troops, that's a very real form of resistance. And if you put yourself in Butler's shoes for half a second, he's got 10 or 15,000 guys in the most populated city in the South at the time, New Orleans. He's about as far away from the main line of Union troops as you could be, unless he was in Texas. I mean, he's, if he went south, he'd been in the water. He's got nowhere to go if the Confederates counterattack him. So he takes discipline and order very seriously. The best way to do that is to reward loyal households, so they'll support him, and if people are disloyal, to keep them shut up in their households, keep them off the streets, things like that. So I think, even though a lot of people at the time and still today look at General Order Number 28 as this really nefarious order, first of all, I think it's part of a much larger shift in Union strategy of how they address civilians. And second of all, specific to Butler's location, I think it's a very savvy order to target Confederate women and the Confederate household in a way that's going to make them adhere to the order. Many of them don't, but it's a savvy order, I think.
Like, do we have instances of more women dumping a chamber pot on a general's head or on a soldier's head? And
as far as I know, there's only one example of that, and I should know this as a Louisiana historian, but I think it was Admiral Porter. I think that was the one that had the chamber pot emptied out on him. But we do have other instances of women after this order wearing Confederate flags on their dresses, or laughing at a Union funeral procession. Eugenia Levy Phillips laughs at a Union funeral procession, and she gets carted off to Ship Island for a few months, and then she's released, and she and her family go to Georgia. But honestly, there's from my understanding, and I did a lot of research for this book, I found very few women that were actually arrested and held in any prison while the Union is occupying it. So, in contrast to the prevailing lost cause mythology that you'll still find in the South, the Union armies everywhere were just rapacious and burned and destroyed everything and treated everyone terribly. Instances like that happened, but if it's going to happen anywhere, it's going to happen in a place like Louisiana. It's occupied for 4 years during the war, and much longer during Reconstruction. And I found very few records of Union troops mistreating women or anything that was outside the bounds of legal warfare.
Right.
Yeah.
So this bit about Benjamin Butler being a Democrat is fascinating. So you said he voted for Jefferson Davis in the 1860.
Yeah, let me see if I can find it here.
So Jefferson Davis was running for U.S. president?
He was one of the nominated names. I don't think he actually volunteered his name to go forward.
And so Butler would, because Stephen Douglas, right, and Breckinridge split the vote, right?
Yes.
If the South could have gotten behind one of those candidates, Lincoln would never have gotten within a mile of the White House. Is that right in 1860?
Perhaps. Douglas, at least according to Michael Burlingame, had really shot his chances for becoming president during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And
who's Michael Burlingame?
He wrote a lengthy biography of Lincoln in 2008. It's
Okay.
a 2-volume biography published in 2008.
Okay.
And he has a pretty substantial analysis of the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the end of the first volume. And he argues that Douglas had little chance at the White House after the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Even though he won the senatorship of Illinois, his public image on a national scale had been pretty ruined.
Now, why?
One, he was unable to successfully refute Lincoln's Republican arguments and anti-slavery arguments, and secondly, because he came out as such a virulent racist in those debates. And there's lots of racist people in the United States, North and South, but it's one thing to be a racist and then have other political platforms that you're using, and it's another thing entirely to just be like, well, I'm not going to respond to any of Lincoln's arguments, but do you know he wants white people to be equal with black people? Well, that's a terrible thing. Many people thought that that's a very shoddy argument. He clearly doesn't have any grander ideas. Popular sovereignty, his biggest trick up his sleeve, is not that interesting. And lastly, he, on several occasions, had disagreed with Southern policies. Popular sovereignty, to a certain extent, is disagreeing that slavery should extend naturally.
Right.
By saying that people get to vote on it, you're necessarily saying that it doesn't happen automatically. And so popular sovereignty did not please a lot of Northerners because it gave slavery a chance to extend. It didn't please a lot of Southerners because it gave slavery a chance to be defeated. And so he boxed himself in.
Yeah, it seems like those two things are contradictory. Like, either he's coming off as super racist, or he's coming across as too soft on slavery, right? My understanding is that, like, the South didn't vote for him, they had to vote for Breckinridge, most of them, because, you know, Lincoln was way too soft on the issue of slavery. Like, for them, so do we know who Benjamin Butler voted for in the general?
As a delegate at the Charleston, South Carolina convention, Democratic convention, he voted 57 times for Davis. I actually don't know if he went to the subsequent Democratic convention in Baltimore, because it split in Charleston.
Okay.
All of the Breckinridge, like, hardline secessionists leave because the delegation looks like it's headed towards Douglas, and they meet again in Baltimore. And I think that's when they nominate Douglas. I could be getting that wrong, but I think they nominate Breckinridge in South Carolina, and then a few months later they nominate Douglas in Baltimore. So the Democratic Party is really, like, split in the South.
Right.
In 1860. I don't know if Butler went to the Baltimore convention. I doubt it, because he ran for governor of Massachusetts as a Breckinridge Democrat, which is really surprising that he, like, adhered that closely to the Democratic mainstream, because he turns around as soon as secession happens and is like, oh, those people are traitors, I'm going to fight them. It's like, well, you supported the presidential candidate that was running on secession, so I don't really get his logic there. But
yeah, I mean, in times like these, wouldn't it be fair to say that our beliefs, our convictions that we believe to be as firmly held as could possibly be, you know, planted like an oak tree, in situations like this, next week you might find yourself in a very different position?
Oh, sure. I think that's true throughout this book, because Confederates say, we'll always resist the Union. The Union shows up, occupies them, and they're like, well, I've got to eat, so I might as well sign a loyalty oath. I don't mean it. I mean, I have lots of instances of that in the book where Union generals are like, you can't really trust people because they signed the oath. I mean, you should make them do that. But people were very flexible with their core beliefs, as it turns out, during the war, especially if they're in desperate physical, material circumstances. People are more concerned with eating and survival than they are with political rigidity, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
And the Confederates find that out too. I try to write about that in the first and last chapter of this book. The Confederates in Louisiana are very alarmed that their people are like, I'm not necessarily going to trade in Confederate currency. I'll do it in Union currency if that's what's around. And, I will trade with the enemy if they've got food and I don't. The Confederate government is constantly issuing orders like, don't do that, stay loyal, and people don't.
Right. Well, I mean, it would be the other side of the coin would be the surprising thing, right? Mm-hmm. If people are, particularly if you are trying to feed a family.
Sure.
It would be bonkers of anyone in authority to expect that, oh yeah, I have, some sort of loyalty oath or some sort of what currency you trade in or what words you say are more important to you than getting food in front of your children.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a different time in that respect. I don't know, I think it's really important to reflect on. Could you walk us through the case of William Mumford?
Sure.
Because this is one of the... Is this the kind of episode that leads to Benjamin Butler being known as Beast Butler?
That was more of... Well, it was Mumford in combination with General Order Number 28.
Okay.
Which he issues May 15th, I believe, unless I'm mistaken. And then...
May 15th of what year?
1862.
Okay.
And then, unless I'm mistaken, he has Mumford hung on June 7th. I could be off by a day or two, but the point is these two events happen very close to one another, within weeks of one another.
Okay, so walk us through it. What happens with William Mumford?
Mumford, we actually don't know too much about him. He seems to have been something of like a gambler. I'm not sure how he supported his family. He may have been something of a professional gambler. I don't get the sense that he was like a day laborer, so I'm not sure exactly how he was supporting his family. But before Butler gets to New Orleans, Admiral Farragut, or at that time Flag Officer Farragut, shows up first in the harbor with Union ships, and he sends some Marines to go negotiate the surrender of the city. And there's some hemming and hawing between the mayor of the city and the general that's in charge, the Confederate general that's in charge. And
sorry, could you lay out? I've never been to New Orleans. I was supposed to go, and then the pandemic happened. But as you're arriving by sea, would there have been sea walls? Would there have been fortifications? Would the Confederates have been preparing for Union Navy's arrival?
They could have prepared more. They should have prepared more. In fact, the governor, the first Civil War governor of Louisiana, Thomas Overton Moore, complained repeatedly to the Confederate government, we need more men, more cannons to fortify the mouth of the river, which is often known at this time as the head of passes.
Okay.
So, as you might know, the Mississippi River, second longest river in North America, it's very powerful. It pushes out a lot of silt into the delta or the Gulf, whatever term you want to use there. So there's a sandbar at the mouth of the river that was very difficult for boats to get over. So oftentimes small boats would come down from New Orleans loaded with supplies, and then they load the larger ships in the Gulf and they head out to foreign markets. Now they got to reverse this, the Union military does. So in late April of 62, Farragut runs the sandbar, and then there are two forts, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, on either side of the banks of the river that were supposed to hold the ships back. They're not very well armed, and as Michael Pearson, a wonderful historian, has showed us, there was a rebellion in Fort Jackson, very close to when the Union Navy is coming by. So the forts are not well prepared at all to withstand this. And even if they were, Farragut runs past the forts in the middle of the night. And so it's kind of like the island hopping strategy that the U.S. had in the Pacific in World War II. It doesn't matter how well armed your island is. If we just don't attack you, you've got nowhere to go. You're stuck there. So that's kind of his strategy there. We'll just run past the forts. We'll let Butler and the infantry take care of them, and we'll head on to New Orleans. So this doesn't mean anything on a podcast because people can't see it, but the river kind of does this like bowl kind of maneuver before it heads south to the Gulf, and it's in that bowl where the Frenchman Bienville established New Orleans in the early 1700s. He did not have permission to do that, and the Company of the Indies, or the Board of Trustees of the Company of the Indies, was very angry at him for not consulting them first about where to establish the city. But he built it in this bowl because he could see what was coming up the river and see what was coming down the river. Anyway, for better or worse, the geographic location of the city was kind of sheltered by the water because it's got the river to the south in this bowl-like fashion, and to the north it's got Lake Pontchartrain. So it's surrounded by water, and there's only like thin, I don't know if it would be an isthmus or not, but little pieces of land on either side to access it. Okay. So that's why the Navy really gets there first, because they can just use the river to get there. And it's much easier to besiege a city into submission than to storm it with an infantry assault. Lots of casualties that way. So Farragut shows up. He pokes all his guns out and says, surrender or else. And he gives them plenty of time, I think 48 hours, to get all the women and children out of the city, which is another early instance of the Unions beginning to play hardball. Right? There are generals like McClellan who say that we should be as conciliatory as possible, and this war will be over like this. the more you persecute the South, the harder they're going to fight, which is true to some extent, but I think that was always going to be true.
Yeah, McClellan he was notorious for never striking.
Sure.
Lincoln was pulling his hair out.
Lincoln says to McClellan, "If you're not going to use the army, might I borrow it?" But the West, and I'm a big fan of the Western Theater and the Trans-Mississippi Theater, and I guess I should demarcate that really quickly. The West is roughly from, say, the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, whereas the Eastern Theater is east of the Appalachians. Most of that's going on in Virginia and Pennsylvania, Maryland. Mm-hmm. And of course the Trans-Mississippi is everything west of the Mississippi River, which is where this book takes place. But it's there in the West in the Trans-Mississippi where you've got Farragut, you've got Butler, you've got Grant, you've got Sherman, and they win the initial major battles like Shiloh, Vicksburg, Port Hudson, New Orleans. And not only do they win these battles that cut the Confederacy in half, from a policy perspective, they're the ones that are developing this hard war strategy. Like, no, reconciliation is not going to work. As they called Grant, unconditional surrender. Like, you either give up completely or we will pummel you out of existence. So Farragut shows up, kind of implements an early version of this, says we're going to open fire. He sends troops to raise an American flag over the U.S. Mint, which is today a museum. You can go there. I've been there. You can go to the Mint Museum in the bottom, and then it's a jazz museum on the upper floors. But it used to be a U.S. Mint where they printed money and coins and things. And also they wanted to retake the Customs House, and I forget what other federal buildings they were after. But the U.S. Mint is the big one because the Confederates had taken all the money out of it. And they had no hopes of getting that money back, but they at least, by raising a Union flag over this building, could say, we're reasserting Union authority here. And then they go back to their ships.
How much money would have been there, though? I mean, given the state of Confederate finances, I mean, did some of the gold just disappear into the undergrowth? Was there... Was there much significant gold there?
I should remember this number off the top of my head. I can't remember if I put it in the book.
I don't want to put you on the spot with details. That's less important than just like...
There was certainly money there that the Confederates grabbed up, and it disappeared into their treasury, as far as I know.
So if there was significant gold currency, right? It wouldn't have been a trivial thing to transport it overland, right?
Certainly not. And this is something I didn't talk too much about in the book. I don't think I talked about it at all. But I know Confederates hid some of their gold at the various consulates that were friendly to them, like the Dutch consulate, the French and Spanish consulates. And Butler, at one point, that's the thing that gets Butler kicked out of the Department of the Gulf. Not the Women's Order, not Mumford, all this stuff. It's the fact that he wouldn't stop fighting with the consulates, because he would just go in and take all of their stuff that they said was their stuff, their money, their weapons, their cotton, and they were really just holding on to it for the Confederates. And he knew that, and he was like, you don't get away with that. I'm gonna take it. Anyway, I've wandered far afield of Mumford. Mumford climbs on top of the Mint, is one of several men.
This is after the U.S. flag has been raised?
Yes.
Okay.
This is, I think, April 26th. Don't quote me on that exact day, but it's before Butler arrives on May 1st. So It's in the waning days of April.
Okay.
He and some other men rip down this flag, and they tear it up into pieces, and they hand it out to the cheering crowd around them. And some of them, including Mumford himself, are wearing pieces of it on their clothing. It's just a sign of rebellion.
Yeah.
And he's the only guy unlucky enough, as I say in the book, unlucky enough to get his name printed in the paper. So he's not the only guy who did this, but he's the one that Butler can make an example out of. So he orders Mumford arrested, and then he orders him executed for treason. There are two things going on here. First of all, there's a debate over whether Butler has the authority to do this or not, right? Because it's not a war crime to tear up a flag. And there was still some debate, I mean, even until after the war. You know, what do we do with Lee and Davis and stuff like that? Can we put them on trial? Can we execute them? They ultimately did not. Too bad for Butler. I mean, for Mumford, he didn't get that kind of consideration that Lee and Davis got. But Butler says, I absolutely have this authority because his example is going to weaken social order if he causes some sort of riot. You know, it's going to undermine my ability to maintain my defensive position in New Orleans. So he's got to go. The second thing that's going on there, which I believe is a historiographical intervention on my part, is that this is a symbolic attack on Southern masculinity. Right? He comes in, he takes a rebellious Southern man. Butler literally ignores the tears of Mumford's wife and children, begging him not to kill Mumford, which is, as I point out in the book, it's a form of household war, right? It's not the same thing as guns and cannons, but if you've got some woman on her knees before you begging you, and you have to say no as an act of war, right? That's a very dramatic public display of we're going to maintain this line of loyalty and nothing will deviate me from it. So, yeah.
I read, I don't know if I was reading between the lines or if you say this. Did he get consumed with guilt afterwards? I mean, he supports the widow. He secures her a job, right?
He got her 2 jobs.
Okay.
One in the post office, I think, and I can't remember what the other one was. But yeah, this was after the war. So he not only continues to take care of her during the war, but does so afterwards. Maybe he's consumed by guilt. I think he's he's following the rules of patriarchy in the 19th century, right? You take care of women and children. He had been directly responsible for removing bread from their mouths by killing their patriarch, and so he kind of substitutes himself as patriarch there.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's history so much as like psychology or American studies, but that's the point I was trying to make.
I would say it's a wonderful way to blend all of these things together, you know?
Yeah.
And so, was there overt resistance to this? Was it a public execution?
It was a public execution. Butler was threatened many times with assassination. He ignored all of these letters, and there was a big crowd that attended Mumford's execution. And a lot of people, of course, were threatening, if you go through with this, the crowd is going to get out of hand. And it's not funny, but maybe in a black comedic sort of way, as soon as Mumford drops through the hatch and is hung, the whole crowd just goes silent. And after a while, everybody just goes home. So there was no public backlash to this. Of course, people said lots of things on paper, but there was no violence committed as an act of resistance because of this. So arguably, Mumford's execution is more effective than the women's order, because women keep resisting in subtle or not so subtle ways. But Confederate men, they never execute Butler. They never capture him, even though Davis basically puts a hit out on Butler. He promises, I think, $10,000 for Butler in his General Order Number 111, issued in December of 62. So there's a big rhetorical fight going on over the meaning of occupation, but Butler never faces any sort of criminal repercussions from the North for that.
Right.
And there was a committee on the conduct of war in D.C. that the Republicans had put together, the Radical Republicans. The Radical Republicans love Butler. They don't care that he's a Democrat because he is willing to get tough on the South. And it's after the war, even though Butler remains a Democrat, he's one of the guys waving the bloody shirt and saying that you cannot vote for Southern politicians. We have to maintain the Republican standard because this is what the South did to the North. They killed all these Northerners through treason. So Butler's a fascinating guy. He's a bundle of contradictions, in my opinion. But I started this project being very skeptical of him, and I ended it being rather enthusiastic about it.
Okay, interesting. And how would you kind of put that enthusiasm together with your, how do you put it? Yeah, the Union occupation was kind of a realignment of white male authority. What do you say? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Butler he doesn't single-handedly do this, but he's a part of this larger effort from Northern generals and Northern politicians to say, in order to be considered an American citizen, you have to be loyal. I almost put this in the book, either in the conclusion or in the acknowledgments. When I went to graduate school in 2015 at LSU, when I was signing all the paperwork, because graduate students are also employees. We sit that weird line between student and employee. Mm-hmm. One of the pieces of paper that I had to sign was a loyalty oath to the state of Louisiana and the United States.
Interesting.
In 2015.
Wow.
One day I will return to occupation. I've kind of diverted myself to environmental history for my next project, but one day I'll return to occupation on the larger level and figure out what's going on with loyalty oaths and why they're still around in many places.
Right.
This is a product of the war, where there's a great book by a guy named I can't remember his first name. His last name is Matheson. Eric Matheson, The Loyal Republic, Traitors, Slaves, and the Remaking of Citizenship in Civil War America. And I'm probably going to butcher his argument, but loosely speaking, before the Civil War, people are more loyal to their state nations, their individual states, and after the war, they're more loyal to the nation as a whole. It's kind of like that argument, I think that James McPherson argued that before the Civil War, people said the United States are plural,
right.
And after the war, they say the United States is.
Yeah.
So Butler, I believe, firmly, is a part of this process of saying, like, look, I'm here. I'm stuck in New Orleans, surrounded by Confederates. How do I militarily maintain defense, but also how do I reconstruct the South? And these two things overlap in the terms of loyalty.
Yeah.
You've got to sign an oath. I found this great picture in Harper's Weekly that I just almost fell out of my chair when I found it, and I was so happy to include it in the book, of all these women signing the oath of allegiance in June of 1863. So they're going through and they have to sign. This is another major intervention of the war. It's not just men who have to prove their loyalty, right? It's women as well. And there are other historians like Stephanie McCurry who've done a lot more work on this. So the war really politicizes women, and men come to a point where they recognize the political and military viability of women as citizens. And so if you're in this sort of rhetorical blacksmith shop, right, of the Civil War, and the nation is red hot and being reforged in the fire of battle, how are we going to reshape democracy? It's clear that white men have to be loyal in order to vote, in order to be able to run for office or get appointed sheriff or whatever. I talk about that a lot in Chapter 3. The Union Army doesn't have enough soldiers to man all of its positions, so they just start filling all those positions with loyal Southerners. Where do black people fit into that? And it is certainly amazing and excellent and positive that slavery as an institution was destroyed, but politically and socially speaking, I don't think the Civil War really did a great job of forging a biracial republic. And so these are the 2 points I'm trying to make very broadly. That the Civil War reforges white masculinity and femininity as well. You got to be loyal to the United States, and everything's fine. We can go back to the way things were. Look at Abraham Lincoln's December 1863 proclamation, the 10% plan, as critics called it. You get 10% of your voting public from 1860 say they want to create a unionist government, you can do it. That's very lenient. You look at it from the black perspective, some black men gain the right to vote, some of them even hold political office, but relatively quickly after the war, the Republican Party just says, we're done with this. The Union Army, of course, shrinks and retreats, and Jim Crow comes in. And more or less restores the racial order as it was before. So, Civil War has a huge impact on reshaping the national identity of white people. Maybe not so much black people, I think. I think that was another 100-year process from the 1860s to the 1960s with the modern civil rights movement that really said, hey, you kind of left an ellipses here at the end of the Civil War, and we really need you to hammer out these rights more effectively. Because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which result of the Civil War and Reconstruction, are amazing. They're not really enforced really well.
Yeah.
So, I think I answered your question.
Well, yeah, it reminds me of Martin Luther King's talk of the check coming due, the check getting cashed. I still don't quite understand, because when you say the realignment of white male authority and that happens under Butler, but you're also enthusiastic about Butler, I'm still not understanding the tension between those two things. But also, so regarding these women, whether it's taking loyalty oaths or whether it is just their resistance or lack of resistance to Union occupation, did you notice as you're working in the archives, as you're just, deep down in the weeds of this, do you notice a difference in class? Are women of different classes behaving differently? Does the Union Army care if, illiterate low-class women are taking loyalty oaths or not?
They do, but those women were far more likely to sign loyalty oaths.
It's the lower class?
Yes.
Okay.
It's upper class women that have a lot of social prestige to lose by looking like they're aligning themselves with the Union occupation that are far more reluctant. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't do it. This past month, I was in Louisiana. My wife and mother-in-law and I went to a plantation there, and I cannot recall the last name of the family that owned the plantation, but there in the plantation house, they had I don't know how they got this out of the National Archives, maybe it was in the family papers, but they have the original protection document that General Nathaniel Banks replaces Butler in December of 1862, signed to this woman at her plantation saying, we will protect this property because you have signed a loyalty oath. So there were some elite men and women, especially closer to Baton Rouge, closer to New Orleans, closer to the Union Army, that would sign loyalty oaths in order to protect their property. Otherwise, as happened with Butler's Order number 76, I believe, Southern property gets sold away. It gets auctioned off, and the money goes into the Union coffers. Once that happens, suddenly Southerners are a lot more lenient, a lot more flexible. Oh yeah, I'll sign a loyalty oath now to hang on to my property. So there's not really, you asked about class. I don't think there's much of a distinction in class. I think there's a distinction in geography. Okay. The closer people are to the Union, the more likely they are to sign the oath because they don't want to lose their property.
And so the Union really does care if, quite poor people are signing these oaths or not. Okay.
They want everybody to sign. And as I mentioned in Chapter 3, and I think again in Chapter 5, they've got, the Union High Command has officers out in all the parishes they occupy making these registers, as they call them. They're like, go to every household, find out how much it's worth, how many people are living there, and whether they've signed the oath. And I could never actually find any of these lists, these rosters. So either they're in some box that I didn't find, or they've been lost to time. But I certainly found lots of individual, I don't know what you would call them. They're just pieces of paper in which a person would come into the provost marshal office. They would state their name. They would state every piece of property that they own. Like, here's my chairs, here's my tables, my silverware, here's how much land I have. And
movable and immovable.
Yes.
You had to document.
Yes. And and then it would be signed at the bottom by some provost marshal and saying they've come in, they've given a statement. they want to sign the loyalty oath, or they don't want to. They want to be registered as an enemy. I found lots of those individual files. I never found like a big like book of just names. I'm sure it's out there somewhere.
Right.
But I know they were making those efforts.
So, what would be the motivation to come in, go through that rigmarole, and declare yourself an enemy? That you have protections as an enemy combatant now?
They had very few protections. They couldn't be executed, and they couldn't be like beaten or starved. They could have their property taken away from them. That doesn't mean that they always did. But Butler issues an order. I think it's 41, maybe it's 76. I'm probably getting all these numbers confused. The problem is these generals issue like just hundreds of orders, and keeping them all straight is bewildering. But he issues an order sometime in the summer or fall of 62 that says you have to register. You have to sign a loyalty oath, or you will be registered as an enemy. And once you do that, your property is liable to be sold, and you might be banished. And the Union Army banishes people all the time, not just in New Orleans, all across the South, anywhere where they are. A good example of this is Ellen House in Knoxville, Tennessee, who went around in Knoxville. She was like late teens, early 20s, just did anything she could to anger Union troops and always needling them in some way. And then she was ordered to leave. And so banishment is this common tactic to rebellious women. It's a nice middle ground because you don't want to be the guy in the 19th century to throw a woman in jail. Because what does that say about your honor as a man, that you would throw a woman into some beastly dark dungeon and leave her there? But on the other hand, you can't just let her keep on keeping on behind the lines, waving Confederate flags or doing whatever. So
right.
Banishment is this nice middle ground of like, well, you didn't play nice, you got to go.
And was this whole Lady of the Night thing much more widespread than New Orleans, or was that a thing peculiar to New Orleans?
Like by Lady of the Night, do you mean
like social pressure? Fall in line, or we're going to treat you not as a good woman. We're going to treat you as a prostitute.
That only happens in New Orleans, and I don't think any other Union commanders replicate that because of the fallout from that wording in particular.
Okay.
Even Lord Palmerston over in England like gave a speech to the House of Lords, or maybe it was the House of Commons, saying like, this is why we've got to recognize the Confederacy, or at least support the Confederacy, because they are facing enemies like this, and Butler is ravaging these women.
Now, wasn't he also, which was not true, by the way?
No, not
right?
true, and England never recognized the Confederacy, but there were definitely people in England who wanted to.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and this minister you're talking about was one of them, right?
Yes.
So is it possible this is just specious? He's glomming onto whatever he can.
It's certainly propaganda, but I think even though it's not true, other Union commanders see that and they're like, well, we've got to fight the war, but we're not going to fight it that hard because then it's more trouble than it's worth.
Okay.
Grant does another thing that kind of gets him in hot water when he takes over Memphis, and I need to know more about this. He dismisses all Jewish people from his lines. Like, he banishes them when he takes over Memphis. I guess, I don't know how much of an anti-Semite he was. I'm not sure why he was so upset with the Jewish merchants in Memphis. So there are other examples of Union commanders issuing some pretty, like, dicey orders that they either just kind of push under the rug or they have to walk back in some way.
So meaning he conquers Memphis,
Mhm.
he's now in control, and
Yes.
he banishes the Jewish merchants previously resident there.
Yes.
Okay.
And sends them out of line, said you can't be in the city anymore.
Okay.
Probably to cut down on inflation, probably to cut down on people gouging prices because resources become quite limited during the war. But the fact that he would target just the Jewish merchants is a bit problematic.
Right.
Like I said, I need to know more about that. I'm not much of a Grant scholar. Another example is, of like weird Union orders is both in Memphis and in Nashville. And I don't know how long this went on. Maybe just for a few months, but the Union commanders actually regulate prostitution. So they like get all the prostitutes registered, and they have to come in periodically to be inspected for disease, and they could go back out and conduct their business. That's fine. They just have to do it in an orderly way, right? So, which I think is just great. I mean, it's so progressive of the Union Army to be like, it is so much trouble to try to get rid of prostitutes or jail them or banish them. It's just easier to just legalize it, but control it. And I don't know why they didn't implement that more across the South. Anyway,
you mean Union troops?
Yes.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, it does in general in wartime make sense to accept reality rather than to attempt to suppress it. I'd love to talk a little bit more. I mean, we can go in any number of directions, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about guerrilla warfare.
Sure.
How that played out in Louisiana and further afield, because the way that the women were helping rebels who were just in the cuts and in the forests, and then melting back into the cuts, into the forests, seems like part of the same coin, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, you've got soldiers and organized, but then you've got this very nebulous guerrilla warfare happening, and you're in enemy territory. Most people are going to be friendly to Confederate, whether they're regular or irregular troops. But then I'd also like to get to the issue of democracy, and you talk about forced democracy a little bit, and so any ideas on where you want to go with those 2 points?
Sure. Let's talk about what guerrilla war is, first of all, because it is a practical consideration, and what I mean by that is it's a military strategy, right? It's a different kind of military strategy than we're going to line all of our guys up according to the Napoleonic code of warfare and wait till we can see the whites of their eyes and shoot. And this is a very honorable, quote-unquote, form of warfare, according to the mores of the 19th century. Guerrilla warfare is dishonorable warfare, right? That's the way the Indians fight. Now, when the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, was doing it in South Carolina against the British, we love him. That's right and good. But when it's the Taliban, when it's Al Qaeda doing it, that's immoral. They're heathens. It's terrible. This is a dialogue.
When the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord are doing it, then we're generally thumbs up. What about Nathan Bedford Forrest?
I don't know if I would consider him a guerrilla or not.
Okay,
I would consider him a cavalry commander who may have sometimes used guerrilla tactics, but if you look at Fort Pillow, if you look at Bryce's Crossroads, he's fighting war. I mean, certainly not what occurred after he conquered Fort Pillow. That was a war crime. But in terms of just like fighting battles,
I'm not familiar. What happened? First of all, where is Fort Pillow?
Fort Pillow is in eastern Tennessee, and I can't remember exactly when this happened. It was sometime in 1864. Fort Pillow was largely occupied by black Union soldiers that had been recruited, of course, after the Union Army had come in and did away with slavery. And as Andy Lang talks about in his book, this is part of the reason why Union forces are so eager to recruit black troops, because every black soldier you put in uniform means you can shift a white soldier to another location. Right? You can leave the black troops in occupied areas because occupation is it's easy, it's boring. You just make sure that nobody steals Grandma Sally's chickens, and you register these people to vote, and you just wait till the war's over. It's much more complicated than that, I think, as most scholars of occupation have shown. But anyway, all these black troops are in Fort Pillow in Tennessee. Forrest captures the fort and either orders his men to kill many of the black soldiers after they've surrendered, or just doesn't lift a hand to stop them. It's like Nixon and the Watergate situation. Did he know? Did he order it? Is there a distinction between those things? And I'm not saying that Watergate is the same kind of crime that Fort Pillow was, but the idea is the same.
Right.
There's some controversy about what he did or did not do. But anyway, beyond that, in terms of strategy, I think Forrest is much more of a traditional cavalry commander and less of a hit and run, wait in the bushes kind of guy.
Okay.
Much more small scale guerrilla warfare is like that.
So to what extent did the Confederacy embrace guerrilla tactics in the face of superior
This is also
firepower?
Subject to controversy. In 1862, the Confederate government issues the Partisan Ranger Act, which basically says if you cannot join a regular Confederate unit, it is totally fine to join a guerrilla unit and just start attacking the Union. The Union says, no, that you're violating the rules of war. That's not a legitimate form of warfare. The Confederates are like, you're invading us. Look at what happened in Napoleon's Iberian campaign in the 1810s. That's a totally legitimate form of warfare. Look at the way the Russians resisted his invasion in 1812. That's a totally legitimate form of warfare. That's what we're doing.
Again, look at the Minutemen.
Yeah.
Concord and Lexington. Yeah.
So this is a debate that has gone on for as long as there has been quote-unquote rules of war. I don't know that we'll ever really figure out where does the guerrilla fit in, because guerrilla fighters always see themselves as freedom fighters. Right?
Yeah.
That's why we have movies like The Patriot or Braveheart. Right? This kind of figure is very inspiring to people. To the people that are fighting those kinds of freedom fighters, they're always lowlifes, criminals that are using nefarious tactics. They're little better than murderers. And in Missouri, in particular, you had some Confederate guerrillas just executed summarily as soon as they're captured by Union commanders, and there's lots of fighting about that. A great book, if you want to learn more about that, is from my PhD advisor, Aaron Sheehan, The Calculus of Violence, in which he covers the entire war and pretty much any sort of controversy about violence that you can find. And here's what one side said, here's what the other side said, and what kind of reasoning are they using to get to this point. The reasoning that the Confederates are using with guerrilla warfare is we have to resist somehow. And if most of our troops are concentrated in the Army of Virginia, which Lee commands for most of the war, or the Army of Tennessee, which various commanders held, but think of fighting Sherman at Atlanta, then west of that, especially west of the river, we don't really have major armies, so we have to have guerrilla warfare. As soon as New Orleans falls, Governor Moore, and I think I quote this proclamation in the book, says, stand on every shore, stand at every place, and fight, resist. So Confederates see this as freedom fighting. That's one aspect of it. Union officers and soldiers see it as troublesome at least and war crimes at the most. There's a third aspect here which I tried to get at in this book, again using this analysis of household war. Guerrilla warfare is also a civil war in and of itself, because there are Unionists in Louisiana that don't support the Confederacy. They're either joining the Union Army, or at least running to Union lines, or they're establishing their own guerrilla groups, often known as Jayhawker bands. And Confederate guerrillas are attacking the Jayhawkers are attacking them. This happens in Arkansas, this happens in Missouri as well.
Right, I was going to say, Missouri was a huge site of guerrilla war
Absolutely.
during the Civil War. So, yeah, this seems, rather than over and above the harumphing that the Union would do about, did the Union have, were they thinking about it in terms of, okay, how do we neutralize this guerrilla war? How do we keep the civilians as far as we can manage on side? How do we manage a deft blend of carrots and sticks?
Yes.
Were they going through this process in the kind of documents you're reading?
Yes.
Or okay.
I would say the first half of the war, it is really down to the individual commander. So it's Farragut, I think, maybe Porter, pretty sure it's Farragut, who fires on Donaldsonville, Louisiana in August of 1862 because some guerrillas rode up to town. They used the houses as cover to fire on Union ships on the river, and they ride away. And he says, "This has got to stop. I know you're letting them into your house to fire on us, and if they keep shooting at us, we will bombard the town." And that's what happened on August 9th, I believe. And every time something like this happened in Louisiana or anywhere in the South, Confederates say, "War crime, you fired on civilians," and the Unions say, "Legitimate act of war because we warned you first." It's kind of like when the U.S. dropped leaflets on Hiroshima and Nagasaki first. And there's still debate today about is that enough warning? Was it still a war crime? Again, atomic warfare, not exactly on the same scale as guerrilla warfare, but it's the same sort of debate. What responsibility does the aggressor have towards the defender? There's probably a similar argument from the Middle Ages or the early modern period of shooting diseased bodies into besieged cities. I've heard of this at points. I don't know how true this is.
It's almost certain in the case of the instance you're talking about that triggered the Black Death in Europe. Almost certainly it's an urban myth.
Okay.
But no doubt bodies were getting, in severed heads, were getting catapulted into besieged towns and cities. That was a widespread phenomenon.
Okay.
In a terror tactic, let's
Sure,
call it.
sure.
But no, in the case of that story that, in the 1330s, Mongols besieging Kaffa in the Crimea, the Genoese colony, and then knowing that there were these diseased corpses infested with the Black Death, and hoisting those into the city via catapult, and then the Genoese sailing through the Black Sea, through the Eastern Mediterranean back to Europe, and carrying the Black Death with them. Almost certainly that's a myth, because imagine yourself as a commander or as a foot soldier besieging this walled settlement, this walled city. If you know that a corpse is diseased, you're not going to go near it. You're just you as the besieger are just as at risk, just as vulnerable to the predations of disease as the besieged are.
Yeah.
It happens all the time that besieging armies get wiped out just as the besieged gets wiped out by disease.
Sure.
So almost certainly it happened in a more prosaic way. Rats in grain ships and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Well, even if it's a myth, the idea of the argument is there. Of what sort of responsibility, if any, do attackers have towards defenders, and how do you work that out? For the first half of the war, it's kind of this give and take between Union and Confederate, and it comes down to the individual commander. I think Butler puts out a reward for any guerrilla that gets captured. The big turning point is Lieber's Code. Francis Lieber, you might be familiar with, is a German immigrant who leaves after the Revolution in 48, comes to America. He taught at Harvard and Yale, I think, so he's a political scientist.
Okay.
And in the middle of the war, the Lincoln administration comes to him, and I forget what books he had written prior to this point, but he was known as a prominent theoretician, and said, "We need you to write us some sort of code of conduct that we can use in the war, primarily because of guerrilla warfare, but also, as scholars like Stephanie McCurry and Leanne Whites have argued, women are a huge part of this as well. The Union commanders are trying to figure out how do we responsibly handle enemy women." So Lieber writes Lieber's Code. It's issued to the military as General Orders number 100 from the High Command sometime in 1863. I forget exactly when. And it's very lengthy. It covers almost anything you could think of, but it matters for our discussion for two reasons. One, if we're talking about women, it says women can be considered enemy combatants. They can be captured and held in prisons until their men surrender or they surrender or agree not to do anything anymore. But if they're not combatants, you have to protect them. So this is how he straddles this line. Overlapping with that, and more towards this question of guerrillas, the second important thing for this conversation that he does is say, in no uncertain terms, that guerrillas are not legitimate combatants. That he completely repudiates the South's logic and says they must be treated as enemies of the state, not as insurrectionaries who can surrender and have good terms like an enemy soldier can, someone in uniform. Guerrillas don't wear a uniform. They don't use formal military tactics that we've all agreed to. They're criminals. So that kind of settles the question. It's no longer a matter of an individual Union soldier or general's discretion. It is now federal policy that guerrillas have to immediately stop what they're doing, or they will be treated with a summary sense of justice, or at least they can be treated. There's not really a lot of examples of guerrillas being executed by the Union Army. There are some examples, but not many. So even though it was written in this code, it's another one of those examples of where the Confederates, with the lost cause, point to the Union and say, oh, they were terrible and doing all these things, when there's really not a lot of evidence there in practical terms to back that up. But the rhetoric is there. And so being a guerrilla was dangerous, not only for the reason that you're in a war, but also if you were captured, you could be considered a spy or a criminal, and you could be summarily executed without trial. And just to reinforce the point I made earlier, especially in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, you have households fighting households. That's sort of a civil war within the Civil War. The same thing happens in the Revolution. You have a lot of Tories in the South that are fighting loyalists and Tories fighting patriots. And so it's not just the British Army fighting the American Army. You also have these individual families that are like raiding each other's farms and things. Same thing happens in the Civil War.
Okay. The business about Tories reminds me of, hopefully this is a good segue into a little discussion about democracy.
Sure.
At the funeral of one or more, I forget, of the rioters killed by British troops in the Boston Massacre, right? The so-called Boston Massacre. Sure. Back in the Revolutionary period.
I appreciate that qualifier, so-called. People forget John Adams defended all those British soldiers that fired on the...
Yeah. The story goes, and this might be apocryphal, I picked this up in I'm not a specialist, but I picked this up in my reading years ago. So at the funeral, there's a lot of commotion, and there's this old Tory of Boston, and he's debating a radical, and he says, and I've picked this up. This is such a common trope. I've found references to this in the early modern and even the medieval period. He says to the radical, they call me a brainless Tory, he says. But tell me, my young friend, which is better? To be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, meaning the Mad King George, or by 3,000 tyrants not 1 mile away?
Yeah. That line appears in The Patriot as well.
Okay.
Mel Gibson gets to say it.
Okay. So, you're talking about forced democracy, and this really reminded me of, meaning the Union is an occupation of the South. This is this is what's going to happen, at least for a very short period, as you say. Some black men had the vote. Some black men even came to Washington to serve. Certainly many black men were serving in the state legislatures immediately post-war. And then and then that collapsed when the Union Army withdrew. It reminds me a lot of the rhetoric that you heard all across the South in the era of the Civil Rights Movement, right? That we are going to desegregate schools, says the federal government. The South says, that is federal tyranny, they say. This is getting imposed on us against our will. We, good Southern, white Southerners, are the Democrats, and you, the federal government, and all who support it, are the tyrants.
Yeah.
How do you make sense of this? With your, with the talking about the forced democracy,
sure.
You talked about the ideal of republicanism, was inspired, to take up arms against the slave power and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you see these contested conceptions of democracy playing out in this period?
It's a lot like this discussion of guerrilla warfare. It depends on what side you're on. So I know we were talking about how black people fit into the American democracy. Let's back up even further, and particularly with chapters 1 and chapter 6 of my book, I'm looking at what the Confederates are doing. And the reason I threw them into a book about military occupation in Louisiana is because to an enslaved person, slavery is occupation. Slave patrols, the overseer has a whip, has a sword, a knife, a gun. To unionists who don't want to secede in, say, Jones County, Mississippi, or southern Louisiana, or eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, the Confederacy is a foreign entity that's occupying them, and they want the government to come in and save them. And if we look at the Confederacy and say, they violated the Constitution, they violated the tenets of republicanism because they denied the power of representative democracy as soon as it wasn't their representatives. They treated people terribly. Taxes went way up. They were, as I talked about in my first chapter, they're banishing people that don't agree with the Confederate government. All that proves that the Confederacy was not a democracy. Terrible. Villains of history. If you say that, you have to flip the table around and say, well, the Union was doing the same thing. So that's what I was trying to wrestle with in this book, is the Civil War really challenges the very concept of what a democracy is, because politically speaking, a democracy is supposed to be something where everyone is involved, at least in some way, in self-government. Right? Maybe not the guy who just walks into the voting booth once a year doesn't have the same kind of power as, say, Abe Lincoln, but there's some sort of equality there. Well, if women don't vote, Indians don't vote, and black people don't vote, I'm already suspicious that it's a democracy to begin with. But I didn't really get into that in the book, so we'll set that aside. Once you add coercion on top of it, like, yeah, you can participate in our Republican form of government. Did you sign that loyalty oath? Okay. Did you, if you didn't, we're going to take all your property and sell it or whatever. Like, that just doesn't seem... Can we define that as a democracy anymore? I tried not to have a firm yes or no in the book. I just tried to just suggest that if you even have to ask the question, that we need to think about this more deeply. And lastly, if the Confederacy is not a democracy, furthermore, if the Union is not a democracy because it's employing conversion and coercion, because it's employing various racial tactics in the way that it recruits black troops, is the United...
Sorry, what tactics are you talking about?
Sometimes they force the black men to join the army whether they wanted to or not.
Okay.
There's a great book from 1976 called Slaves and Freedmen in Louisiana, who goes into much more depth than I do. Of, like, some Union recruiters came to Louisiana and would physically beat and whip black men until they agreed to join the Union Army because they had certain quotas to meet. They're forcing them to work on levees. They're forcing them to work on military defenses. They're separating them from their families. I talk about this a lot in Chapter 5. That doesn't seem to me to be very fair to a major subsection of the population. So again, democracy seems suspect. So if the Confederacy is doing bad things, the Union is doing bad things, let's put them back together. The Civil War is over now. We're one united nation once again. Are we a fair and equal biracial republic? Doesn't look like it. I mean, one of my, I hesitate to say favorite because it's a tragic story, but it was at least one of my favorite sources that I came across that I put into the conclusion, where this Corporal J.B. Burdick reports the guy named Baptiste Como is a number of men in the neighborhood have been laying around his Negro cabins at night trying to shoot some of the Negroes, like it's target practice or something. And the formal battlefront Civil War may be over, but the racial war was still well in hand. So my opinion about American democracy is that it's not completely villainous, it's not completely corrupt, it's also not completely non-existent, despite some of the more exaggerated things that I like to yell in the hallways sometimes when we're debating. But it has certainly been delayed a significant amount, a full inclusion. And I define democracy very broadly in this book, and there might be some people that argue with me tooth and nail over this. Democracy should not be just defined politically. It has to be defined socially as well, because Reconstruction proves it fundamentally. Constitutionally, black people, at least black men, were equal according to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But from a social perspective, it doesn't mean anything if you write into your laws you're allowed to vote if once you get there you're turned away from the polling place because the government will not take the sheriff to task who's turning away black voters or something like that. So in order to understand democracy, we can't just look at the politics. We have to look at the social order of the thing, the spirit of the thing, as Tocqueville might say. And by the way, he got that from Francis Lieber. The spirit of the street, as he called it, which he was probably inspired by the 48 Revolution, was more important to democracy than its political institutions. And Lieber told Tocqueville, Tocqueville met Lieber when he was traveling in America in 1831. He said that it is the spirit of the people that flows upward to the institutions, and the institutions are just reflections of the spirit of the people and not the other way around. And I think you can see that to some extent in Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, especially because he goes on and on and on about the townships in Massachusetts and how that's like foundational to American democracy. And my three-word response to that is Salem witch trials. But if you say look at Reconstruction as a kind of witch trial where whites pursued blacks, I think that this gives us pause to question the nature of democracy and how effective it is and how inclusive it is. Not to be completely despairing about it, but to encourage us to work all the harder. Because I'm not as enthusiastic about American democracy as a lot of people are. So when people today say, "Oh, Trump is ruining American democracy, Biden is ruining American democracy," I don't necessarily disagree. I just think that what else is new? Like, this has been true for years and years and years. There's always been some wolf at the door, and 2024 feels uncomfortable to us as white people, depending on what side of the political aisle you're on. But if you're a Native American or a black person or a woman before the 1920s, democracy has already failed those people. So anyway, I'm kind of launching off into modern day.
I think this is a great way to. There's so much to say, but I just want to get clear on that last thing you said. I thought you were about to say, well, everyone who didn't have the vote 50 or 100 years ago now does, but it's still failing.
I said failed, like past tense.
Okay, so that you would see that as a progressive.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I hesitate to say that we can measure democracy's progress only in legal terms or only in political terms.
Right. We always have to be aware of the gap between theory and practice.
Absolutely. Because I'll use this example again of the guys taking shots at Baptiste Como's black workers. Slavery's over. The institution of slavery is gone in 1865. It's perhaps the most triumphant moment of American democracy ever, because it's a people's war in which a radical crusade of the people in the North have overthrown aristocracy in the slave aristocracy in the South. It's this great triumph of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And you still have these guys taking pot shots at black folks. So if we only read history from the lens of the Constitution, or if we only read it in terms of whose name gets put on a voter registration sheet, that's only like part of the story, like a quarter of the story. And that's why I'm a social historian, because the practical stories fascinate me more than these big triumphant narratives of American democracy. And it's a really weird line to tread, because I don't fall into this category of far leftists that utterly condemn America as the most evil nation on earth. But I'm very, very far away from people in the center and also the right that are like, America's the greatest triumph of democracy ever. I'm somewhere in like the middle left, where it's like, not so much, but it could be.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that, when you characterize the Civil War as a war of the people overthrowing a slave aristocracy.
That's only one viewpoint, by the way.
Exactly, yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, you'd have people to the left of you calling Lincoln a tyrant.
Sure.
And, of course, the entire South calling him the same thing.
Sure.
So, I mean, there's just so much more to say. But let's leave it there for now, and we'll pick up on this theme of democracy soon. Maybe when we do de Tocqueville.
Sure.
Yeah. That would be an excellent tie-in.
Yeah, I find Tocqueville fascinating because he's very detailed, and yet for all his details, he's so wrong about so much. In my opinion,
he is. I'll be interested to see if we agree on where he's right and where he's wrong. Because he's. This is a great way to wrap up. But congratulations again. It's wonderful that your book, Garden of Ruins, is now out.
Yeah.
And I hope listeners will check it out for themselves.
Yeah, I hope it's well received. I haven't read any reviews yet. I've had more than one historian tell me, never ever read reviews of your book. Doesn't matter who writes them. And I said,
wouldn't be surprised, but it's too soon for reviews. Just
probably,
yet, right?
Yeah. It'll probably be a few months, but
I mean, in my various fields, reviews will trickle in a year, 2 years, 3 years, sometimes more afterwards. Yeah.
Well, whenever they come out, I hope they are merciful enough. I mean, there are things that I would change about this book. Other things I wish I had cited. I'm doing research for my next book now, and I'm coming across sources. I'm like, that would be great if I had found it when I was still writing my first book. But
I know what you mean. Yeah, there's no such thing as a final draft.
Yeah.
You just have to let it go sometimes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for interviewing me.